welcome to part 2 of the video lecture series for Chapter 5, C Sharp, CIS 285. All right, what I've done is I've taken the form from part 1 and sort of just put some more buttons on it. So this isn't making a new project. This is the same chapter. As you notice here, I have a write, a read, and a pen button. And what we're going to be looking at for this second part is how to create stream writers and readers in order to create text files. I'm doing it a little bit different than the book. There are a bunch of different ways to do this, and I will explain what I'm doing and why. But first, let's go to the code. Okay, one thing I want to tell you about is what's called the region statement. If you've got a lot of code in here, and we may have talked about this before, I'm getting a little bit confused between VisualBasic.net class that I'm teaching online and this one, but you can do regions in both. There's a keyword called pound region and then the text that you want to show up on it. And what you can do is collapse entire sections of code to get it out of your way and clean up the real estate. And here's a bunch of code that I had in this first button where we were doing loops in part 1. So I want to get rid of that. As you can see, it just collapses all that code. And I could do the same thing for each one of these. And putting the name of the actual event handler up here helps me find it better. All right, so let's go all the way up to the using section. You're going to need using system.io for this. That's input output. Okay, and here's my right-click event handler. Now, what I'm doing is I'm doing this a little bit differently because there's something in the try-catch that they haven't mentioned yet. It's called the finally statement. The finally section runs regardless of whether try succeeds or fails. All right. If I'm going in here and I'm creating a stream writer object, which is what I'm going to do first, and this is a path to where I want to put it. You can, if you don't give it a path, just give it a name. It's going to put it in the debug directory where your exe resides. I've got a directory I've created on my jump drive here called files, and in there I'm going to create a file called write-to-me.txt. All right, and I'm using the new statement because what I'm doing here is I'm inheriting from the parent object StreamWriter, and the child object, the one I'm going to be using that inherits all the properties and methods from the parent, is called myFile. And new calls the constructor, and that creates the StreamWriter object and opens up an empty file that's in this location. All right. The reason I put the finally statement in here and did it this way instead of the way it is in the book is because they don't handle closing that file object if there's an error. So what happens is if it throws an error here and this runs, if you don't have the finally in there, it's not gonna close that object and you're gonna get a memory leak. So I always put finally and close all my objects there. You don't have to, but it's a good idea to think about it that way. So here's what's going on. I'm creating a stream writer, and I put this, anytime you're opening a file doing math, anything that might throw an error, you need to put it in a try catch. So inside the try block, I'm writing separate lines. You could use the write method if you wanted to create a bunch of pieces of text all on one line. So if you wanted to create a comma delimited list, you could just do myFile write palindromes semicolon and then the next one semicolon, so it would, you know, or comma, whatever you want to. I want separate lines, right? So I put 3 lines of text in here, and if it throws an exception, this will run, and regardless of whether it throws an exception or not, it will close my file, you know, when this is complete or when it throws an error. Okay, so let me make sure I don't have one out there already. Let's see, there's my directory, and I do have one, so let me delete that so it'll create it that's from testing purposes. All right, so let's save it, let's run it, and let's create the file. Now you can put breakpoints in here and find out, you know, if you're getting errors or whatever. All right, so I'm going to click the write button. I didn't get an error. Of course, I didn't tell it to display anything when it finished. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this. I'm going to go back to my file directory on my passport here. or files, and there's the file my program just created. Let's open it up and see what's in there. And there's the text that I put in there, palindromes, right? As you can see right in here. So I had 3 write line statements, each one writing out a line of text. So that worked successfully. Now let's look at the read button, which is going to open this up. And now in the read code, I have a file, a while loop that's going to, as long as that file has something to read, it's going to open it up, and I've got an output string that I'm going to output once it's finished in the message box. It's going to grab the current line of text, append it into this output string. The plus equals the same thing as saying string output equals string output plus whatever. Another reason you do that, as you recall from the 150 class, is you'll wind up with the last line of text if you don't append it. So the plus sign is the concatenation for strings in C#. And then after I get that line, I'm sticking a new line character on there, so I'll have 3 separate lines in my output, right? So another reason to do this is you could be opening up an empty file, and if you try to read from an empty file, it's going to throw an error, and then it would come down here and do that. So what this is saying is, while it's not the end of the stream, in other words, there's something to read, go in here, read that line, stick it in my output string, stick a new line in there, and keep going until you've hit the end of file marker, all right? Which there's an end of file marker in those text files, and you'll see that when you're reading through the chapter. Then I'm outputting it, okay? And there's my finally. So let's run it. We know the file exists because we just opened it up, and I'm going to click the read button if I ever get it up here, and it shows me what's in that file. I just read it each line at a time and this was just a plain old string, an output string, and I stuck a new line character on, so I have 3. Otherwise, it would just be palindrome, a man, a plan, a canal, Panama, blah, 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 all in one line. I didn't want that, so I did it that way. Okay. Now, let's look at the append button for a moment. You can check to see if a file exists, and if it doesn't, create it. But if it does, open it up to append to it, or in other words, to add more lines of text. This is a little more complicated, not a lot. So I've got here my stream writer. I'm not using the new here for a reason, because they're using this using statement. And it's saying if the file does not exist, go ahead and create it, and then put the original text back in there. All right. Now, we know that ours exists. But if the program didn't know that, I mean, we're not going to know typically. I know because we're playing around with it. But if this didn't exist, it would create it and put this text in there as if it already existed. If this is false, then it's going to skip that and go ahead, and that means the file does exist. There's no need to put this default text in there. Then it's going to go ahead and open it up for appending purposes, and it's going to write 1 additional line there. Okay? So we know it exists because we just looked at it. Of course, the program at the time is not going to know, so that's why we're doing this. If it doesn't exist, create it. If it does, just open it for append, for writing to it. So I'm going to click append 1 time, and then I'm going to go back up here and click read, and I should have another line of text that says I'm out of ideas. So let me click read, and there it is. If I hit it again, it's going to put it in there again, right? There's I'm out of ideas twice, and I keep banging on it. And there you go. So, writing to text files or INI files is fine. Typically, you write to a database, but if you just need a quick and dirty thing where you just need to generate some text files, it's pretty important. So there you go. I'm not going to talk about random numbers because there's just nothing to it. Just remember to add 1 to it. I think it's on page 325. There's almost nothing here. You just generate a random number between 1 and some number. And we've done this in the 150 class, so it's pretty straightforward. There's almost nothing in here about that. I'll hit the major parts. So we got 2 parts to this chapter, and I will see you on the next chapter. Enjoy.